I'm about to take this average sounding mix to sounding significantly better like this, without touching a single plugin. We're using the same sounds, the same processing. I only changed one thing, and that's the balance of your mix. As producers, we're so quick to reach for an EQ, compressor, saturation, that we actually forget something incredibly simple. If the balance isn't right, then no plugin is going to fix that. In this video, I'm going to show you how I build a mix from the faders up and how I use a reference track to make sure that those decisions are actually working. If you're new here, my name's Miles, and if you enjoy practical production techniques that you can actually apply in your tracks, make sure you subscribe. So point number one is going to be what balance actually is. So when I say balance, I'm not talking about finding the correct volume for each individual sound. The kick doesn't have one correct volume. The bass doesn't have one correct volume. Their levels only really mean something when it comes to being in relation to something else in the track. And that's what balance actually is. The relationship between other elements. For example, if your kick is too loud compared to the bass, the low end can feel overwhelming. If the melodic elements are too loud relative to the drums, then your groove can disappear. And if everything is fighting for attention, then the track starts to feel really cluttered. And I feel like the main reason why producers overlook this is because adding a plugin or an EQ feels like you're adding something productive to the mix, whereas moving a fader can almost feel too simple to be the answer. But a mix with a bad balance and great processing is still a poorly balanced mix. The first stage is what I call the static mix. It's the balance you establish before you do any dynamic processing. So before compression, saturation, and any other processing that can change the dynamics or the levels of your track. And there's a cool bit of history here. Mixing engineers were sometimes referred to as balance engineers, because at its core, that's exactly what mixing is. Balancing the relationship between the elements in your mix. Obviously, the tools have changed massively since then, but the fundamental principle remains the same. And that's exactly what we're going to do here. We're establishing a balance before we reach for any processing. And there's something really useful that happens when you do this before you add any processing. It starts to tell you if you actually need any processing. If I feel like a sound already sits perfectly in the mix, I might not even reach for an EQ or saturation. But if I get the levels right and I feel like something still isn't working, now I actually have a much better idea of what to do to fix that problem. So before I ask, what plugin does this sound need? I want to ask, are the relationships between these sounds actually working? So for the balance, I'm going to actually use a reference mix. And to avoid any copywriting, I'm just going to use my own unreleased track that I've already mixed and mastered. So straight away, there's a couple things that I like to do before I start balancing all my elements together. First of all, you want to pick a reference track that is the same genre or subgenre of your record, and also make sure it's a similar energy level to your own track. I wouldn't go picking a peak time roller with a minimal groove that you've made. So like I said, I've just picked my own track and I've thrown it in here under reference mix. Now straight away, I've changed the routing from main to external out. So what that means is if you have any processing on your master, in this case, I don't, but if you do, you should change this to external out, because that means it's going to bypass any processing that you have on your master. Step 2, I'd put the level as -10. The reason why we do this is we're going to check the balance with the reference track. And since this is already mastered, it's actually really loud. So we want to allow for headroom while we're mixing. So setting it to -10, I feel is a safe barrier. So you can have headroom when you go to master. Another thing I do is I'd actually print out your mix before, and that will be so you can compare the mix before to what we do after balancing. So make sure you do those two things before we get into the balancing. Cool, so the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna balance the kick with the reference track. So we're gonna balance the level of the kick in the reference track with the kick in this track here. You wanna make sure every track is at complete zero. All of your faders are down at the very bottom before we start bringing these in. So just to start, we'll use the kick and just toggle it on back and forth. It's also worth noting that you don't want to entirely rely on your eyes for this. You want to try and close your eyes and think about how they sound together. So about there sounds good. Then we're going to move on to the clap. About there for the clap sounds good. I'm going to move on to the open hi-hat. About there for the open hi-hat sounds good. Now this mid loop. About there's good. Now the top loop. About there's good. Now the snare. So there sounds really good. And then you just keep going. So there sounds good for the sub. Now the organ. Now we can pull the sub back a little bit. Because this organ is obviously going to be a stronger lead compared to the more subby bass line in the reference mix. Turn that up just ever so slightly. So about there's a good balance. Cool, now the counter melody. Okay, so we're going to match it with that little glitchy lead sound there. So slightly down. Don't be afraid to use the arrow keys on your keyboard as well while you do this. About there's good. Right, now the glitch pad. So we can hear a pad in the background with our reference mix, so we're going to use that. About there's good. Now our swell pad. So about there sounds great. Now this ARP. So there isn't actually something similar in the reference track to this ARP. So we're going to use our ears for this one. It can get a little crowded this way. So what you can do is you can turn a few of these off, because the ARP doesn't actually play when everything's playing together. Might even turn the organ off. Cool, that sounds great. Now our reference track does have a string, so So we're going to compare ours to that. Make sure it plays. Out there's good. Now the pitched vocal. So once again, we don't actually have a dominating vocal like we do in the reference mix. And I just know that our pitch vocal doesn't need to be as dominant as the vocal in the reference mix. So like I did with the snare, I'm just going to find the appropriate level by ear. Let's try turning the kick off to see how it sounds. So obviously that's way too loud. It's also a great trick to make things really loud, then pull them back. I like to call it priming your ears. Out there's great. Cool. So this is where I'd normally move into what's known as the dynamic mix. That's where you start using things like compressors, saturation, EQ to shape how the individual sounds behave. But now that we've established a strong balance with this track here, we can then go into the dynamic mix and actually work out if some of these elements need EQ, need compression, or saturation. But make sure after you do your dynamic mix, because certain things like compressors and saturators are going to change what's known as the perceived loudness in your mix. So I like to rebalance after I've done all that processing. So let's go back to where we started. This is what our mix sounded like before. And this is what it sounds like now. So as you can hear, the difference isn't coming from a magical plugin. It's the combination of better decisions, starting with the relationship between your sounds. So the next time you open your session and immediately reach for a plugin, just stop. Build out your static mix first and make sure that the balance is dialed in. And definitely use a reference track to check your decisions. Then move into the dynamic mix and process the things that you actually need. And once you've processed them, go back and do another rebalance. So if you found this video useful, make sure you subscribe and leave us a like below. We've got new production tutorials every single week. And if you want to go deeper into production and mixing, our membership is linked below. Do you build your static mix before processing, or do you normally reach for plugins straight away? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're struggling with your arrangements, you should watch our next video. I go over 4 arrangement tricks to help you get out of an 8-bar loop. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.